Good afternoon. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 20610 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to business. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press the request to speak button now. No member has done so. Therefore, I call on the Minister, Graham Day, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. No member is asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 20610 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed. We are agreed? Yes. The next item of business is portfolio questions, and the portfolio this afternoon is education and skills. I would remind members that questions 2, 4 and 6 are grouped together, and that I'll take any supplementaries on these questions after all 3 have been answered. And, of course, if a member wishes to request a supplementary question, they should press the request to speak button during the relevant question. Question number 1 has not been lodged. I call question number 2. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment is made of the availability of permanent teaching posts for newly qualified teachers.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Carruth.
Presiding Officer, under the 1980 Education Act, local authorities are solely responsible for the recruitment and employment of teachers. Notwithstanding, since 2021, this Government has provided in excess of £800 million to support enhanced salaries for Scotland's teachers, ensuring they remain the best paid on these islands, with the top of the classroom teacher salary scale now at £52,614. In addition, this Government provided extra funding in this year's budget, which uplifted the ring-fence funding for teacher numbers to £186.5 million. Our budget for 26-27 maintains this financial commitment to safeguard teacher numbers.
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. Figures show that nearly 9 in 10 newly qualified primary teachers are stuck on temporary posts, supply work or without a permanent job. This is not what they signed up to when they trained to become teachers. How does the Cabinet Secretary explain the collapse of permanent primary teaching jobs after years of SNP promises to expand the workforce?
Cabinet Secretary.
On the issues surrounding permanence, I very much welcome the fact that this year's statistics show a slight improvement. So the overall post-probation employment numbers have increased from around 69% from 65% last year up to 69% gaining employment. But there are substantive problems in relation to primary teachers, which I do accept. The improvement, though, that we have seen has been delivered as a result of the extra funding that I spoke to, Presiding Officer, in my original answer, which was secured through the budget. And I was grateful to colleagues across the chamber who were able to vote for the budget. And I hope that Conservative colleagues will find themselves this year able to vote for that budget, which again protects funding for teacher numbers and has paid dividends in the last year alone. We also do provide extra funding to Scottish councils via the Scottish Attainment Challenge. We know that across the country that's helping to support the employment of around 3,000 extra staff, of whom approximately 700 are teachers. That is welcome. And in addition to that, we have recently announced a recruitment campaign that I'm sure colleagues will be aware of, which is very much focused on filling the gaps that we know exist in secondary schools in particular. And one of the options I've been exploring with the GTCS, with COSLA and with the teaching unions is how we might be able to fund, for example, the qualification of primary teachers who are unable to obtain jobs in secondary subjects where they may have the necessary qualifications. I talked about this in a bit more detail at Education Committee last week. We'll be meeting with colleagues on this issue in the coming weeks. I'd be happy to give Mr Burnett a written update in relation to the progress we've made on that point.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it has taken to ensure that newly qualified teachers are able to secure stable, long-term employment in light of recent reports that only 1 in 4 newly qualified teachers secured permanent posts in 24-25.
Cabinet Secretary.
I welcome this year's statistics, which I've outlined, show some improvement in the overall post-probation employment levels, increasing to 69% from 65% last year. This improvement has been supported as a direct result of additional investment from the Government's budget. It is worthwhile reminding Parliament that the overall number of teachers in permanent posts has remained relatively stable at more than 80% over the past 10 years. I am keen, however, to enhance the number of permanent teaching posts, which is exactly why funding has again been protected in this year's draft budget. And as a result of this year's additional funding to local authorities, this year's census data shows an overall increase in the number of teachers for the first time since 2022.
Willie Rennie.
With that kind of answer, it's no surprise that the Education Secretary got heckled at the EIS hustings last week, because she has failed to deliver the 3,500 extra teachers that she promised, failed to deliver the permanent contracts that she promised, and failed to reduce the teacher contact time by 90 minutes. She blamed the council, she blames the unions, and she's now blaming the teacher for being paid too much. She's given the impression that she has now given up on delivering all of those promises. Has she given up, or is she going to meet those promises?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Rennie as ever for his question. I recall at a certain point during the EIS hustings, which of course we attended, there were some heckles for Mr Rennie additionally, so we'll just leave it at that, presiding officer. However, I think it is important to say that since 2021 there has been significant investment provided to support Scotland's teaching profession, not least in relation to teacher wages. I provided detail of that in my response to Mr Burnett, but over £800 million of additional... Oh, apologies, Mr Stewart. Apologies. Thank you, Mr Kerr, for the heckle. But that additional investment, of course, presiding officers, helping to enhance teachers' salaries and, of course, maintain the fact that Scotland's teachers remain the best paid on these islands. But we've also had a number of different data sets published in recent months which show real progress in relation to the investment we're providing to Scotland's schools at the current time. Class sizes are coming down from the most recent data that published in December. We continue to have the lowest pupil-teacher ratio on these islands. And, of course, we did secure another record pay deal back in November for Scotland's teachers. So I'm certainly not complacent about the challenges that exist, and I accept, of course, with Mr Rennie's points, that negotiations remain ongoing. But I do think it's really important for teachers' morale to remind ourselves of the strengths that exist in our school and of the significant investment that this government has protected in our budget and invested in our schools, of course, with the support of Mr Rennie's party in the last budget, and I sincerely hope with the support of Mr Rennie's party in this year's budget too.
And I call it question 6, Stephen Kerr.
I hope you noted, Deputy Presiding Officer, she said, "Thank you, Mr Kerr, for the heckle." I shall move on. To ask the Scottish Government
Mr. Kerr,
how many teachers...
Mr Kerr, just for the obviously I'm not really privy to whatever ministers request or members seek in terms of heckling, interventions and so forth. So I know what you say, but don't draw me into your issues. Thank you. Mr Kerr.
Well, I don't really have an issue with the Cabinet Secretary when she says things like that. To ask the Scottish Government how many new teachers who qualified in the last 3 years are now in permanent teaching posts.
Cabinet Secretary.
Figures from the 2025 teacher census show that there are 2,798 full-time equivalent teachers in permanent posts who were part of the last 3 teacher induction scheme cohorts. Since 2014, the percentage of teachers in permanent posts has remained at 80%, and additional Scottish Government investment has led to an increase in the number of teachers in the past year. The permanent employment of teachers is a matter for local authorities who currently employ Scotland's teachers.
Stephen Kerr.
Well, it used to be a few years ago in this Parliament, I used to stand up and say 1 in 8 teachers are on temporary contracts. Now it's 1 in 5 or something like that. I mean, that's shocking. We've gone backwards at a rate of knots. And then further reflection on this reality is the statistical fact that 1 in 10 primary teachers who are qualified, they don't have a permanent job, don't have a permanent job in their first year. So this is not success. So whatever happened to this agreement with COSLA, this funding agreement that was going to guarantee teacher numbers? And at what point will the Cabinet Secretary get really serious about these issues that we keep raising in this chamber and bring forward a properly thought out and planned workforce projection?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Kerr for his question. He touched on a number of points. One relates to the issue in relation to primary teachers. He may be aware of the reduction that I have delivered in relation to the number of primary teachers we are training. In the past year, we have reduced the number of primary teachers for the exact reasons that he has set out. I also gave some detail of this in my response to Alexander Stewart in relation to the potential for primary teachers to move into secondary subjects where there are gaps at the current time. The member will be aware of the marketing campaign that we have launched just very recently, which looks to target some of those areas where there are known gaps, but also where we know there are primary teachers with the prerequisite qualifications who may be able to move into the gaps in those vacancies as and where they exist. Mr Kerr also mentioned the COSLA agreement, which of course was negotiated through last year's budget, £186.5 million to increase teacher numbers, or for some local authorities to maintain them at 2023 levels. The reason this is important is to Mr Rennie's point in relation to reducing class contact. We need the right number of teachers in our schools to deliver on that commitment. And I know that Mr Kerr welcomed the progress we've seen in the last year, with teacher numbers increasing for the first time since 2022 as a direct result of that COSLA agreement and investment. And again, I would encourage Mr Kerr to consider supporting the Scottish Government's budget in that regard, because again, it maintains that investment, which we know has made a real difference in the past year to increase teacher numbers and allow us to make progress on reducing class contact.
I have a number of supplementaries. Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary think it acceptable that some local authorities advertise full-time permanent posts only to then tell successful applicants when offering a job that, in fact, the post is temporary? And working with local authorities and teaching unions, what steps will she take to end this deceptive practice?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I do not think it is acceptable, the points that have been set out by Kenny Gibson today. It is important to state that Scottish Government plays no role in the direct employment of Scotland's teachers. So we have 32 local authorities, often with various approaches to recruitment practices. That provides for inconsistency, in my view, but the issues that Mr Gibson has alluded to should not be happening in terms of fair approaches to employment and employment practices more broadly. We will continue to work with COSLA in that regard. I spoke to some of the detailed work that's been undertaken working with COSLA, the teaching trade unions, but also with our initial teacher education institutions in relation to teacher training to help provide a much more consistent approach to the employment of teachers, but also the support that they receive in relation to initial teacher education.
I call Paul O'Kane.
Thank you very much. I raised the Cabinet Secretary's comments with the First Minister last week at First Minister's Questions when, in response to the issue of teachers moving abroad to access jobs, she said that people are opting not to travel to jobs in Scotland and that they're, quotes, much more expensive to employ. Now, the First Minister accused me of skating past his stellar record in education, but I would suggest that he somewhat skated past the defence of the Cabinet Secretary's comments. So does she understand, going to the point that Willie Rennie made, why teachers are so angry by what she said? And does she also accept that a recruitment campaign at this stage in this Parliament, where she promised recovery and made a very clear pledge on teacher numbers, is just not going to cut it?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I thank Mr O'Kane for his question. I think some of my commentary has been taken out of context. It is the case that at the current time, for example, there are a number of teaching vacancies across the country. But I have said publicly, I accept that not everyone can travel and not everyone can move. I have used my own example, as many members will know, of moving to Moray for a year because I ticked the box to go. And as a result, I received, I think, £6,000 as a result. There are financial incentives attached to that. It's now been increased. I know Mr O'Kane will be delighted to hear to £8,000 to incentivise people moving. But the interesting thing from Mr O'Kane's point of view is that we see teachers opting not to tick the box in ways that they did previously. That might be for all good types of reason, but there is a case that people are opting post-pandemic not to move in ways that they might have done. We therefore need to work with local authorities on different ways to support teachers in relation to obtaining employment, because it has always been the case that after the completion of probation, people need to apply for jobs. People are not guaranteed a job in their local authority area. And I don't think anyone in this Chamber, Presiding Officer, would suggest that that is a matter that should change. Instead, we need to work with local authorities on a partnership basis. One of the things I'm really interested in exploring further with COSLA through a review of the probationer scheme, which has not been reviewed since 2002, is how we can jointly with local authorities work on a partnership approach to funding that, because at the current time it's solely funded by Scottish Government. It's in the region of £40 million of investment, and at the end of probation we don't ask local authorities for anything else. I don't think that's good enough. I think we have to have a partnership approach. But we also have to
Cabinet Secretary, I think I've been very generous and giving you a lot of latitude. I think you are well aware of what the response time is supposed to be. Thank you. Keen to get in those who are desperate to ask a question, and that is supplementary for Alistair Allen.
The recent figures that the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned shows that there has been an increase in the number of Scotland's teachers. So can she say how investment laid out in the 2026-27 budget will support furthering this progress?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank the member for his question. The investment that I spoke to has been delivered as a result of extra funding which was provided for in last year's budget to enhance the number of teachers in our schools. So the first increase in teachers' numbers that we have seen since 2022 by 63. I would like to see further improvements in that regard. And it is notable that some local authorities took additional funding from the government and reduced teacher numbers. And I don't think that is politically credible in relation to our constituents and the communities that we all represent. So my officials are working directly with a number of local authorities who chose to take that additional investment and reduce teacher numbers. But to the member's substantive point, the way in which we can enhance teacher numbers is by protecting funding in the budget. This budget this year does so, and I would encourage colleagues to consider voting and giving their support to a budget which will again help to support an increase in teacher numbers.
And supplementary, Ros McCall.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The NASUWT has described the situation as a dysfunctional teacher supply system that is clearly failing teachers, pupils and the taxpayer, and they're right. But let's focus on the pupils for a moment. We know how critical a stable teacher-pupil relationship is to children's learning and well-being. So does the Cabinet Secretary accept that the over-reliance on short-term contracts for newly qualified teachers risks undermining educational continuity for pupils? And has the Scottish Government done any assessment on the impact of this on children's attainment going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member raises a hugely important point. And if we go back to the foundations of the probationer scheme, which I was attempting to finish in my response to Mr O'Kane, although I accept I spoke for far too long, Presiding Officer. The point of that scheme when it was established back in 2002 was that probationary scheme would be in addition to the staffing complement that schools received. I think for many years that's not been the case. It certainly wasn't my experience when I started teaching in Elgin High School back in 2008. So I replaced somebody who had retired. And I think it is important that probationers in particular, notwithstanding the points that Rosa McCall has made, have support and time in school to learn how to become a teacher, because you don't come out of probation as a fully formed teacher. You need to learn, you need that support and time. And it's important we create the conditions for that to be necessary. And I absolutely agree with the member's point in relation to consistency and pupils' experience of churn in the system and that not being good in relation to educational opportunities and attainment more broadly. These issues are being discussed through the wider work that I alluded to in relation to my response to Mr Stewart earlier, and I'd be more than happy to give Ros McCall a written, detailed update on that before the end of dissolution, where we will address the issue that Ros McCall has raised today in more detail.
Question number 3, Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And to ask the Scottish Government what action it's taking to improve the recruitment of teachers in rural areas.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, last week we launched a new national teacher recruitment marketing campaign which includes activity designed to encourage those thinking about a career in teaching to consider teaching jobs out with the Central Belt and in more rural areas. In addition, probationer teachers can receive a preference waiver payment of up to £8,000 if they are willing to complete their probation anywhere in Scotland as part of the government-funded teacher induction scheme. We have manually allocated PWP probationers in recent years, which has resulted in more probationers in hard-to-fill subjects being allocated to remote and rural areas. Finally, in recognition of the challenges outlined in the member's question, I convened a roundtable discussion with COSLA, trade unions, the GTCS and other key partners to explore urgent collective solutions to these and other teacher recruitment and retention challenges.
Alexander Burnett.
Now, within its budget calculations, Aberdeenshire Council is expecting £9.4 million from the Scottish Government to maintain or increase teacher numbers and reduce class contact time. However, this is at risk because teacher numbers have decreased as Aberdeenshire receives an insufficient number of newly qualified teachers through the Scottish Government's teacher induction scheme, failing to get nearly 40% of the primary teachers and 70% of the secondary teachers requested. Now, this trend is happening all across local rural authorities because the SNP aren't providing enough support to attract newly qualified teachers to these areas. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm if education in Aberdeenshire will be further penalised for the educational recruitment failings of this SNP government?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I thank Mr Burnett for his question. I would walk him back to my comments in response to his colleague Ros McCall previously, in which I alluded to the fact that the probationer scheme, when it was previously introduced back in 2002, was meant to be in addition to staff and complement. So I hear the challenge from Aberdeenshire Council. I've met with Aberdeenshire Council a number of times on these issues, and actually the PWP manual allocation of probationers has benefited Aberdeenshire by gaining more probationers. But probationers are meant to be in addition to staff and complement. And we know in the last year, of course, that Aberdeenshire Council was one of those local authorities which took additional funding from the Scottish Government to the tune of just over £9 million and chose instead to reduce teacher numbers. Now, I'm also aware that Aberdeenshire Council is led currently by the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. So there is a political incoherence here with the member's question, which I'm sympathetic to, and the actions of his local authority, which are to take funding that I protected centrally in national government and cut teacher numbers. That's not a coherent approach. I'll be more than happy to engage with the local authority directly on these issues, but we must remember that when central government protects funding for teacher numbers, communities should expect to see that play out in their communities, and that is not what has happened in the case of Aberdeenshire.
I call supplementary from Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We have a shortage of teachers in Murray, but not necessarily a shortage of people willing to teach. Due to the presence of RAF Lossiemouth and Kinloss Barracks, that large military footprint has a number of spouses who travel up with the rest of their family, who are qualified to teach in England, but are barred from teaching in Scotland unless they get a Scottish qualification. It would ease the efforts of Murray Council considerably if this issue could be resolved. I've raised it repeatedly with the Cabinet Secretary, and I think she was sympathetic to the issue. Can we just get a solution?
Cabinet Secretary.
I am, Presiding Officer, sympathetic to the points that Mr Ross has raised. Of course, the matters pertaining to the registration of teachers in Scotland are a matter for the GTCS. I would encourage Mr Ross to engage with them directly. I see that he is nodding. He has. I'd be more than happy to raise it myself with Pauline Stevenson at the GTCS in that regard. It is the case that there are different qualifications required in Scotland, not least in terms of having a degree-level qualification to deliver teaching in Scotland that don't exist necessarily in other parts of the UK. And that's an important feature of our education system. I think it's one we would want to protect, but I'm more than happy to speak to GTCS GTCS on Mr Ross's behalf, but I would encourage him to engage directly. It's difficult for me as Cabinet Secretary to comment on the specifics of individuals without understanding first their qualifications, and that would also be a matter for GTCS, who are independent of government, to give an opinion.
A supplementary, Willie Rennie.
I mean, this is another example of poor workforce planning. To be frank, we're having a real difficulty with a surplus in primary and, by and large, a shortage within secondary. And in remote areas in particular, it's a challenge. The incentive scheme is just not enough. So what other measures is the Cabinet Secretary prepared to consider to make sure that every part of the country have got the specialist teachers that we need?
Cabinet Secretary.
I agree with the sentiment behind Mr Rennie's question, but I would go back to the points I was making to Mr Burnett, and let us look at the Kingdom of Fife, where Mr Rennie and I both represent respective constituencies. Fife Council was in receipt of significant additional investment from the government in the previous financial year of close to £13 million. They took that funding and they cut teacher numbers. Now, Fife Council, of course, is run by a minority Labour administration, supported by the Conservatives, by Reform, and, of course, by Mr Rennie's Liberal Democrat council colleagues. So, I accept the points that he raises today. However, it is politically incoherent to come to the Chamber and ask for additional investment in hard-to-fill subjects and then have council colleagues taking funding from this government and then voting to cut teacher numbers. So I agree that we need to work on the issues in relation to where there are gaps. That, of course, will be identified in some of the work we're doing via the marketing campaign, but also through the work I spoke to in relation to the role of the GTCS, who are very clear that there are opportunities for people to have further qualifications in subjects and to teach in secondary where we know there are subject gaps. So I would just encourage Mr Rennie to work with his councillor colleagues, and I'm sure, very, very sure, that they'll be considering whether or not they're able to vote for the upcoming Labour budget in Fife Council, because last year they supported it and teacher numbers fell.
Thank you. Call question number 5, George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the establishment of the Centre for Teaching Excellence.
Cabinet Secretary.
I visited the centre at the University of Glasgow this week to hear about the substantial progress they have made following the launch in September 2025. 3 research hubs are already open, providing accessible resources and professional learning aligned with priorities that have been identified by Scotland's teachers. And a further 3 hubs will open this spring, including, crucially, one focused on additional support needs, which I updated the Chamber on a couple of weeks ago. Teachers can access the latest research and evidence through the centre, with structured support to apply insights to their practice. 46 seconded teachers act already as points of contact for colleagues in schools, ensuring that research is relevant and practical in our classrooms.
George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary is extremely pleasing for myself to hear that additional support needs were one of the reasons, as someone that's got my eldest granddaughter has additional support needs herself. So with that in mind, can the Cabinet Secretary say more about the role that the Centre will play to improve practice to support children with specific learning needs?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I can't tell colleagues what a positive visit I had this week to meet with the seconded teachers who are already working at the Centre for Teaching Excellence, making a real difference in our schools, listening to the profession and formulating the exact type of support that Mr Adams speaks to in relation to additional support needs. The Centre will have a dedicated hub on pedagogy for inclusion. It will open this spring and it will have that specific focus on ASM. The hub is going to give teachers access to the latest research, evidence and provide practical support to allow our teachers to apply their own insights in their own classrooms, and it will allow teachers to share learning across communities of practice, to engage with expert panels and develop classroom-ready resources, as well as to be supported with teachers seconded into the hub. And I was delighted to meet with a group of those teachers yesterday who are already helping to make a difference to support teachers in our school in relation to ASN. The hub will also link and shape its work from the Short Sharp Review, of course, which I announced on the 15th of January.
And supplementary, Stephen Kerr.
The Cabinet Secretary will know the difference between a mediocre and an excellent school is an inspirational school leader, and we know that we have a shortage of school leaders in our country. So what part of the work of the Centre will be devoted to the development of school leaders, and how will the Cabinet Secretary incentivise more teachers, more qualified potential school leaders to take the career path to school leadership?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I thank Mr Kerr for his question. I met with a group of seconded teachers yesterday, including a couple of school leaders who themselves are now part of the centre and are driving that work forward. And I had a really interesting discussion. The member makes a number of points in relation to driving that improvement. With the Parliament and the Presiding Officer's support, I would like to write to the member in a bit more detail to outline some of the evidence I was provided with yesterday. And I would also encourage Mr Kerr and colleagues who are interested in the work of the Centre to please go to the University of Glasgow, to visit the Centre, to hear for themselves the work that colleagues are undertaking and the really collaborative approaches that are being supported all over the country from local authorities at the length and breadth of Scotland. It's really inspiring and positive work that these teachers are leading on, and I will provide Mr Kerr with a more substantive written update to the points that he's outlined today.
Question number 7 has been withdrawn. Question number 8 has not been lodged. So therefore that, I thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And that concludes portfolio questions on education and skills. There will be a very short pause before we move on to the next item of business. Thank you.